Welcome to the Monocle Banking Podcast, as always curated by Monocle Solutions. This week we get stuck into one of the hottest debates in South Africa, black economic empowerment. Well, for more than 2 decades, South Africa has treated one proposition as almost beyond debate, that transformation and black economic empowerment are the same thing. Question B-BBEE, and depending on which cabinet minister has the microphone, you are questioning redress, you're opposing transformation, or in the more excitable telling, promoting white supremacy. It's a useful political trick, because once the policy becomes synonymous with the moral objective, the policy itself never has to stand trial. But policies are tools at the end of the day, and tools should be judged by what they build and what outcomes they produce. South Africa remains one of the most unequal countries in the world. Economic ownership remains skewed. Black South Africans remain vastly overrepresented among the unemployed and the poor. The legacy of apartheid is certainly not something that's an abstract. It's visible in household wealth, in education, in access to capital, and in who owns what. So transformation remains almost non-negotiable. But does that mean broad-based black economic empowerment must be? After more than 2 decades of increasingly elaborate codes, scorecards, ownership requirements, procurement rules, verification agencies, and compliance industries, we just have to ask the question, what does BEE actually cost and what has it produced? A provocative new report by Daan Steenkamp of Codera Analytics and Donald Mackay of XA Global Trade Advisors tries to put some numbers around that question, and the numbers certainly make for very interesting, if not uncomfortable, reading. Their survey of 126 firms is not nationally representative. It's an important caveat that we'll interrogate today, but the results are still striking. The median initial compliance costs range from 160,000 Rand to 650,000 Rand. Ongoing annual costs ranged from hundreds of thousands of Rand to several million. Only 4% of firms surveyed said BEE had increased net employment. 35% said it had reduced hiring. Almost half reported lower reinvestment at a time when we so desperately need gross fixed capital formation. More than 40% reported lower new investment, and fewer than 2% reported increased new investment. The value of major BEE transactions has fallen sharply from its 2018 levels, and perhaps the most elegant marker, or certainly the experiment of all of this, sits on the JSE, where 2 shares with essentially the same economic rights trade at dramatically different valuations because one can only be sold to a restricted pool of buyers. So one has to certainly ask the question, what is happening? Where are we going? And let's unpack it. Joining me, Dr. Daan Steenkamp and Donald Mackay. Gentlemen, welcome to the Monocle Banking Podcast. Daan, let me begin by saying that this is 3 white middle-aged men discussing BEE, so almost taboo in that context, but we'll certainly have a follow-up debate and invite someone who's maybe slightly more passionately for the policy onto the program. But let me just begin with this intellectual distinction at the heart of the report, because you say that transformation is the objective. BEE is merely a tool. Why has South Africa become so bad at separating the two?
Thank you, Michael. We go to great lengths in the report to make that argument that in South Africa, increasingly BEE has become conflated with the objective of transformation. And so anyone that questions BEE policies or regulations are questioning the goal of transformation. And so what we argue in the report is that for a country like South Africa that has a declining and very low investment rate, declining per capita employment and growth, and increasing regulatory burdens that international agencies like the OECD identifies as a primary driver of weakening macro performance, we cannot afford to treat a failing policy like this as beyond scrutiny.
And I mean, that is the key point here. And Donald, to bring you in on that conflation, would you say it's been, or at least become, more deliberate? Because I think politically it's extraordinarily useful. Once criticism of BEE becomes criticism of transformation, the policy becomes almost unfalsifiable.
Yeah, it's hard not to believe that it is deliberate because it's convenient and it's politically expensive, I would assume, to walk away from BEE. And because government has conflated it and increasingly does conflate it, I think it ironically makes it harder to have a discussion about what might actually get us to transformation. So that's certainly a big part of why we did the report, is to say these two things are not the same. We're going to have to figure out a way to have these conversations where every conversation is not a fight for your life, but just an objective concession that this has not worked, given the position the country finds itself in.
Now, I want to put it to you before we get into some of the data in the report. Probably the strongest defense of BEE that I could possibly muster is that apartheid didn't leave behind a neutral market. We know that. Now, I do a lot of work for the corporate finance industry, the legal industries where I really cut my teeth in journalism. And there's a lot of that kind of old school tie network in briefing patterns. And it left behind accumulated white capital and networks and all of those kinds of things. Why should anyone believe, maybe Daan, to start with you, that simply removing BEE wouldn't allow those inherited advantages to reproduce themselves indefinitely?
I think, Michael, the point that we're trying to make in the report is that when it comes to any regulation, one needs to assess periodically whether that regulation is achieving its goals at acceptable cost. Now, we're not trying to debate the goals of transformation necessarily in our report. The point we're trying to make is that the current policy suite that we have in South Africa is not achieving these goals. And B, it's certainly not doing it at what one, as an economist, might consider an acceptable economic cost. So I think it is very important that our society wrestles with the legacy of apartheid, and that we have policy interventions that are aimed at redress. And we try in the report to focus in on one policy set that has been focused on trying to address apartheid's legacy. But really, we need the same kind of process for other South African policies. And the reason we pursued this is twofold. One is that increasingly there is a view among many in government and even some economists that the failure of these policies to achieve transformation means that we must have stricter compliance requirements and we must raise requirements over time, because that will force firms to invest and employ finally. And so I think that is a wrong-headed, or that's a dangerous path for us to pursue. And I think we felt that it is time for some quantitative assessment of whether these policies are achieving the goals that you've summarized.
And I'm hearing what you say there, Daan. The response to failed policy is to double down effectively on failed policy. And that is a concern, because then we're not having an objective, quantitative, data-led discussion of what the policy has actually achieved. And Donald, just to bring you in, we talk about transformation as this kind of end goal until we are transformed. I'd like to hear what maybe that looks like to you before we get into the data. I like to call it normalization. I think we can all agree that we've inherited an extremely unequal, abnormal society. And it was structurally so, because access to economic opportunities and education and all kinds of other basic human rights as well were denied by the apartheid government. So we need to normalize South African society. And what is that end state? Because otherwise we're going to go around chasing our tails here. Do we have a number in mind? Is it X percentage of Black South Africans being in the middle class? Is it an unemployment rate that sits at a certain level? What is that final transformed South Africa look like to you?
Certainly from my perspective, I'd be quite hesitant to put a number onto that. But I think we've got a broad shape of how it looks. So much of our BEE policies, and I include in here things like employment equity, are an alternative to fixing the basics. So as an example, half of all kids which started school this year are not going to finish high school. And they will be overrepresented in the unemployment numbers 12 years from now. And those kids are not going to go to university. And those that do go to university, lots of them will not finish, or they will do degrees that make them unemployable. And so the list goes on and on. Now, what we are at this point attempting to do is to say, look, we clearly value teachers' union more than we value the pupils that have to go through the education system. However, we still want companies to keep investing. We want them to keep investing despite the fact that our ports are not working, that every business is based in a municipality, and almost all of our municipalities are failing, and so on. And so what ends up happening is we're never creating a foundation to have a country that is economically competitive. But what we're instead doing is we're saying those are unimportant. What we need to do is have a shortcut. The fact that we have large numbers of very unemployable people because the government and society has dropped them is not relevant. You should still employ them, and you should take the hit on that through your profits, etc. You should say, well, we're not going to make an investment, because that's a better alternative in our policies at the moment than making an investment which doesn't tick every BEE box, transformation box perfectly. And so because we've created a trade-off, which is kind of like the devil's trade-off, there isn't any good options with what is put in front of us, we're kind of shocked that investment, whether it be investment in capital, in factories, or in people, does not happen. And the reason I think this ends up occurring is because we say, look, despite all of that not happening, we somehow believe we can achieve a transformation goal. So if you asked me what would the country look like, I would say at the very least, everybody gets to the starting line with a fair chance of succeeding. Instead of the situation we're in now, where if you're born in Diepsloot, I can tell you statistically what your future is likely to look like. And unless you're connected with somebody who can throw you a tender in your future, the odds are quite good you are going to be as poor, or if not poorer, than your parents and grandparents were. And that in itself is a problem. So I think these are alternatives to the hard work. They allow the politician to say, we have a solution to this that doesn't have to cause a difficult conversation with the unions, for example. We can have it all, and that is just never possible.
Yeah, it's a real Hobson's choice, as you describe it, where it looks effectively or politically like something is changing, but only really one option is being offered. And it's an option that is, and we can see it from the evidence, producing unemployment and economic stagnation as a byproduct. But we'll come to that. Let's look at the data. Daan, the state collects a mountain of BE information, as far as I'm aware. Certainly, as a small sole prop, I've always got to fill in forms and declarations declaring that I'm just one white male individual. Yet your argument is that we still cannot conduct a serious national cost-benefit analysis. What exactly does government have that it's not publishing that led you to go out and conduct your own survey?
That's right, Michael. So despite more than 23 years of the implementation of BE policy, and the enormous amount of resource that individual firms spend on compliance and then accreditation, the government does not publish any of this data. So as a society, we are spending an enormous amount on reporting to compliance requirements, but we're not able to evaluate at all whether this compliance spend is achieving its goals, or for that matter, how much this compliance spend actually is in rand terms. So we felt that it was therefore time for a survey to try and quantify firms' own experience of the costs that they bear to comply and their own quantification of the potential benefits that they get from compliance. Now, the difficulty is that the compliance costs that firms will bear will differ depending on the size of the firm, the industry they're in, and also the choices that they make to comply. So as a result, any survey is always going to struggle to fully represent the full cross-section of the experiences of firms in South Africa. But what we tried to do is ask firms to go back to their financial statements and, to the best of their ability, summarize the costs that they've gone to set up their compliance, and then the ongoing costs that they bear year to year, and then also to evaluate whether they see benefits from either their current, for example, score, the BEE ratings, or whether they would see any quantifiable benefits from raising their score, or whether they would see whether there'd be any negative impacts on their business should they lose their current compliance or go down in one level.
Yeah.
So
just to touch on the methodology just quickly before we move on. So 126 firms surveyed, obviously not nationally representative. How did you select them? And could there be a selection bias here? Because wouldn't it be that firms that might be unhappy with BEE are more likely to complete a survey about the costs of BEE?
I think that's an important question, Michael. So we did try and send the survey to as many firms as possible across different industries and different firm sizes. We sent the survey to several different member organizations, including organizations where we hoped there would be firms that draw significant benefit from the regulations. So we tried as far as possible to get as broad a selection of firms as a starting point. Now, of course, because we were asking very complicated questions that would require quite a lot of effort from owners or the accountants of the firms that are being surveyed, you'd expect perhaps a lower response rate overall than perhaps an easier survey. And we were very careful in the way that we described the purpose of the survey and questioned firms' experiences. So though we cannot guarantee that this is representative of South African firms' experiences, it's certainly representative of the experiences of the firms that did respond, because they provided very detailed estimates, and we took great care to disclose all of the questions and the response and aggregate the responses that we received.
Just one last question before we dive into the data. How do you then separate the effect of BEE from everything else that has damaged investment in South Africa? And I'm thinking here, Eskom, as I sit with yet another power outage and crime and weak demand and corruption and all of those kinds of things.
Again, we tried to situate the purpose of the survey as being narrowly focused on BEE regulations as they relate to firms' BEE scorecards. And we made it clear that we were trying to measure that exclusively and not other policies of redress or other macroeconomic constraints that firms face. We tried to narrow in each of the questions on, when it came to costs, on the specific costs that firms went to for things like skills development or supplier development, etc., on the accounting side. And then we also asked firms subjective assessments of whether the BEE regulations specifically affected their choices surrounding employment and investment choices.
Now, Donald, the central argument, the economic argument at least, is from the data, BEE seems to function as an implicit tax. And the median numbers are large, but there are extreme cases, extraordinarily extreme, compliance costs exceeding annual profits in some firms. Firstly, can you explain this idea of BEE as an effective tax? And what exactly are companies spending all of this money on?
Yeah, so it is an effective tax, and it in many ways behaves like a tax, which is when you you raise the tax beyond a certain point, it starts to generate negative returns. So what we're effectively doing with BEE is we're giving people a list of things they have to do if they want to, number one, do business with the state, if they happen to be in certain sectors. So BEE will hit you much harder if you're in the mining sector than if you're a business that was started by an individual black guy on his own and he never accesses government work. The cost of BEE starts to ratchet up as you touch on to sectors that are particularly sensitive. Government, of course, being the most sensitive, but some of the others I had mentioned. And so as this cost rises, you're faced with a dilemma, which is, do I keep investing in this and in the hope that I will get a return greater than that investment? Or do I eventually opt out of the system? And you will see a fairly substantial number of guys just, said, well, we're just not going to play the game anymore. We're now a level 8 or we're non-compliant, and that's what it is. So I think the underlying problem and why this starts to behave like a tax is you're being compelled to do something you don't necessarily want to do, which most of us feel that way, I guess, about a tax no matter where you are. But in a well-functioning society, you can see the positive outcomes of the tax being paid. The hospitals are there, the roads are maintained, you're safe and secure, etc. The challenge for most companies here is you're making the investment, and if you're a supplier to government, for example, you may have no option but to make that investment. That does not mean that it is a positive experience for your business. So what are all of the things you could have done? How many more people could you have employed, etc., if you were not incurring the cost? And perhaps just another small comment to what you'd said earlier, Michael, is when we selected this, we essentially selected those costs that are quantifiable within a company. So we didn't look at what is the opportunity cost and all of these things. We simply said, what are you spending the money on? And we kind of broke it down into the different compliance areas. So we're looking at this. In fairness, we didn't audit it. This is not a representative sample, although, by the way, I personally made an effort to go to people who could connect us to businesses that have benefited from BEE and ask them to complete the survey. But unfortunately, it appears as if none of them chose to.
That is in itself telling, I think. So if we look at it in terms of what exactly companies are spending this money on, how much is genuine empowerment and how much is what I would call the BEE industrial complex of consultants and advisors and verification and lawyers and all of that stuff? And is there actually a way of estimating how much of every rand nominally spent on transformation reaches an actual beneficiary?
Michael, I think the difficulty here is that even though we asked that exact question, so we asked firms to differentiate between different categories of spend, both for startup of their policies as well as ongoing compliance. So we asked them to break it down as far as possible. The difficulty is that different firms do such different things to comply that we ended up having to summarize, to aggregate these, to get to figures that we could compare between firms of different sizes and in different industries. So we ended up typically just showing the total annual spend in the most recent year for firms, and then we expressed it relative to their turnover or their profits. So the only way to really answer that question is for the government to publish the compliance data that they collect. That would allow one to actually quantify all of the different costs that firms are spending. And the difficulty here is that it's also very difficult for firms to extract this information from their financial statements without a fair amount of effort. So I think the combination of the compliance data that's reported, as well as I think a more comprehensive attempt to do cost-benefit analysis using the full data that government has access to through things like the combination of SARS data and then compliance data, would enable to give you that fuller picture.
Donald, just to bring you in again, Parks Tau himself, the Minister of Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, says that too much empowerment spending is fragmented and poorly targeted, and that some companies fund entities that qualify on paper without building real capacity. Well, I mean, isn't that exactly what a points-based compliance system incentivizes at the end of the day? And to remind, Goodhart's law says that when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. Has BEE become one giant South African example of that?
Yes. I mean, there's no question, which is why we see all the effort around BEE, but no actual transformation or very little of it happening. You've created a scorecard. You shouldn't be shocked when people try to focus on the score rather than the game itself.
Daan, one of your most serious claims is that BEE creates cliffs around firm growth, moments where getting bigger suddenly brings heavier costs and obligations that you touched on earlier. Can you just take us through that mechanism? Are you saying that a rational entrepreneur may deliberately avoid the next employee or the next contract or the next R1 million in turnover because crossing the threshold changes the economics of the firm?
Yes, we see that both in macroeconomic data and in microeconomic data. What you'd expect as an example in the case of BEE, that there's a cliff at 10 million rand. So there is under 10 million rand turnover, firms can automatically qualify as small enterprises and get a BEE level 4 score. So you see proliferation of the number of firms in South Africa. So we see if you look at average firm size in South Africa, it has collapsed over the last 2 decades. It's down more than 80%. And that's both because of an increase in the number of firms that exist, while you have a fairly stable number of employers. So there does seem to be some evidence that you have a proliferation of registered entities. And then, of course, we didn't focus on employment equity here, but you see the data that is available suggests that there are also similar cliffs, the 50 person firm level. So firms choose to stay smaller on average than they might have without these regulations existing. And so the reason this really matters is that there's a big amount of international evidence that suggests that firm growth is an engine for economic growth and productivity. And the fact that we see South African firms stay small, not graduate into growing, is very bad for South Africa's productivity, and of course very bad if you are trying to create employment.
Well, and for a country that so desperately needs what economists call scale-ups, firms that move from 5 to 50 employees, then 500, you're talking about a policy that unintentionally or intentionally is punishing the exact moment when those companies need to begin to scale. So, I mean, that is a really important finding. That would you say, Donald, to bring you in, that the burden is asymmetric here, where you've got a large incumbent, and we know the competition authorities, to talk about other policies that we have, often targets the large incumbents. It feels big is bad. They can hire compliance teams and spread the costs. If you're a young challenger, you simply can't do that. So does a policy intended to transform the economy sometimes protect the incumbents against new entrants?
Yeah, so all of these protectionist policies, by their nature, always favor large businesses over small. For the simple reason, if nothing else, that a large business tends to have more money, and so can both spend the money on this, where smaller ones can't, and secondly, use it as a barrier to keep competitors out of the market. So, yeah, it is counterproductive without a question.
Let's come to investment, and we so desperately need gross fixed capital formation. Almost, what is the National Development Plan, if we can still remember that old dusty document, say we need, 30% gross fixed capital formation if we're to hit growth rates of 5 to 6%. Almost half the firms in your survey, Daan, reported reduced reinvestment, more than 40% lower new investment. What are they doing with that money instead?
So I'm afraid we didn't ask them that, but that is an important question that you pose. The sense one gets from the survey results is that when you tax firms, that passes through to profits. So firms are going to not grow And there's also clear evidence from the survey that at least the firms that these regulations bear on also do not employ more people. And so this is why in the report we discuss the macro background that more generally, South African firms have experienced higher levels of compliance costs from a variety of different government regulations. These have gotten worse over time, which means that South African firms have become less compliant. We see this expressed in profit margins that have been declining across industries for the last decade. And so, it should be no surprise that South Africa's economy is in the doldrums, that firms don't invest if the profit outlook is worsening over time, if it doesn't make sense to grow the business, and if they find it difficult to expand their markets.
Yeah, and again, coming to the opportunity cost, Donald, a foreign investor could often look at this and simply choose Nairobi or Dubai or Mauritius or London. And how would we ever know how much investment never arrives? And this is the great difficulty with opportunity cost, isn't it? You can count the BEE deal that happened. You can't easily count the factory that was never built.
As time goes by, it sort of becomes apparent what was not built, because we can look at our gross fixed capital formation at a point in the past, that we could look at it now and we could say, well, this is where we should be, and these are the factories that were not ever built. On a different project, I interviewed the CEO of a very large investment bank, who said that the one number we never count when we look at the public interest commitments one has to make in a merger with a local firm is the number of people who simply take one look at the conditions and it never goes further. The Competition Commission never hears about it. It just ends there. And I suspect that is a much bigger number than we'd ever be comfortable with.
Donald, let's get to what maybe I think the cleanest example in the paper, that Sasol empowerment share. Can you explain why you regard this as something close to a natural experiment?
Yeah, I mean, this is fascinating. There may be more of these, but I just couldn't find. This example is you have perfectly identical economic rights. The only difference between the empowerment share and the normal Sasol share is that the empowerment share cannot be sold to anyone who would not be at the same level as the person making the sale. So you have to be black, you have to sell to a black person. And it turns out that the only reason that really matters is not because of great concern about the black shareholders, but because Sasol, because of their other interactions with government and the state, are required to maintain a minimum level BEE rating. So the effect of that is that BEE rating is funded by that discount, which is over 50% of the unencumbered share. So you get the same dividends, you get everything else is identical, but if you had been granted those normal shares in Sasol, and you possibly would have decided to sell, that would have negatively impacted Sasol's BEE rating, but you as a shareholder would have been far better off. So it's
But Donald, could the policies defenders argue that maybe that's the price of preserving black ownership, and that empowerment assets were never intended to be perfectly liquid?
Yeah, I'm sure they would argue that, but which is an interesting point of punishing black people for being black.
Another example was Burger King, wasn't it? Where we had black shareholders wanting to sell an asset, and the transaction ran into trouble because the buyer would reduce the company's empowerment status. Again, we have all of these outcomes that seem to be against the spirit of what the policy is intending to do here. And even that should be enough for us to just pause and reflect and say, what are we actually producing? What's happened inside these schemes and with the policy that is creating such abnormal outcomes? We've been hard on the policy. Let us now be fair. What has BEE achieved? Daan?
We show in the report, we provide some summaries of the extent of transformation in some categories of the professional population. So, for example, among skilled employees. And we can certainly see that there has been a broadening out of particularly Black male and female representation in some categories of employment. We, of course, although it's very difficult to get reliable figures, it is highly likely that ownership of assets in equities and other forms of assets have broadened out, but it's unfortunately, again, without published accreditation and compliance data, it's very hard to verify and report on. But clearly, there has been some progress that has been made. I think the question that we ask in the report is just, is the current policy fit for purpose? Is there not a better way to achieve the goals of transformation at more acceptable cost? What we are particularly worried about is that the way things are moving currently is that there is an attempt to raise the effective tax rate, which we've reported on, and force compliance. And we expect, given what we report in the report, that these kinds of amendments will actually achieve the opposite. So for South Africa to achieve faster economic growth, for us to deal with our unemployment problem, for us to have better success at transformation, current framework, we argue, is just not the best way to get there. And we need, as a society, a sober debate about reform.
Yeah, and it's almost the Laffer curve that we talk a lot about in tax, but applied to this kind of policy. So what replaces it? Donald, you wake up tomorrow morning, you read in Currency or the Financial Mail that BEE is repealed. What would replace it? Would you move from race to socioeconomic disadvantages? I think some in the DA and elsewhere have proposed, or household income or wealth. And if you do that, how do you prevent a class-based model from ignoring some of the facts around inherited disadvantage? I mean, it's tricky.
It is tricky, but I think an important first step is to acknowledge that if something's not working, you shouldn't just keep doing it until an alternative arrives. So, the main thing when you have a really cracking headache is to stop hitting your head against the wall.
Yeah.
I think the second part of this is there has to be far greater political accountability for dealing with the fundamentals of what make a competitive economy. You cannot replace education with a kind of a policy right at the end that says, if you're the guy that's lucky enough to be positioned right, you can be part of a deal. There's got to be something more fundamental so that the broad base of society has an opportunity to improve their lives. And, those are many. Why do we have so many dysfunctional municipalities? Why do we have so many kids not finishing high school? And those that do can't read for meaning and can't do basic arithmetic. So if you don't fix those, it's not clear to me how any policy is going to fix the economy. I don't think you can trade one off against the other. So I would have an absolutely ruthless focus on the factors that create a competitive economy. And that needs to be where the policy is, not in these kind of plasters that we put in over the brain surgery that we are attempting to do.
What frustrates me, Donald, and I want to stay with you for a second longer, is that is exactly the kind of difficult conversation that we need to be having. But whenever you criticize the policy, you have a minister somewhere saying that, no, the critics are just promoting white supremacy, or they're harking back to the bad old days of apartheid. I mean, what does that do to evidence-based policy debate when you see that coming from the highest levels of government?
Yeah, I don't think, Michael, that is actually an accident. I think it is politically expedient to not deal with the issues and not allow your actions to be criticized. So until we get to a point where we recognize that outcomes matter way more than political speeches, we are going to have a problem. I mean, we're talking about BEE here. We can have the same conversation about lots and lots of our economic policies, which are viewed as off limits from discussion. You can't talk localization, because to be anti-localization is to want to destroy manufacturing jobs, and so on and so on.
Do you get the sense that the GNU has done anything to create any kind of genuine political opening to rethink the architecture of economic policies? Because what I get, and to stay with you again, Donald, and my big disappointment so far in the GNU is that it seemed to be so hastily cobbled together, as the Constitution demanded, in 2 weeks, and there was never really a coming together of the various coalition political parties, a thrashing out of where you find agreement on economic policy, where you fundamentally disagree, and then to let the ideas that are strongest prevail and come to the South African public with a shared economic agenda. I haven't got that. I still feel like this is just old ANC policy in new GNU bottles, so to speak.
Yeah, I would agree with you. But, there's an interesting document that was published by the presidency sometime during COVID. I think it was at the end of 2020. And it was a document on how to formulate and assess and measure policy. And it's a pretty good document. Of course, like all good documents, it was immediately ignored by everyone. But if we just looked at those principles of how you formulate policy, how you assess it, what you do when policy is not working, etc., there's not a lack of knowledge on how to do this better. It's just that doing it better is uncomfortable and requires real work. I think at this point, all the parties in the GNU find it much easier to govern by media releases and interesting stump speeches rather than doing the hard work of real change to the economy.
And that's got to start with education. Undoubtedly, for me, I mean, you mentioned reading for meaning and the Pearl study that 8 out of 10 children by grade 4 cannot read for meaning. That is just, it's a crime against our own people that we are setting the next generation up for failure and sending them out into a labor market where, to your earlier point, they are unemployable, and then trying to create policies forcing firms to employ these individuals who've been failed by a public education system. We're going to have to leave it there, chaps. Really fascinating chat to you. And I look forward to continuing the debate and the discussion as certainly the shibboleth has started to fall. And we can debate this. We can talk about the failures. And perhaps the most important point is the simplest, in that transformation isn't a scorecard. It's certainly not some shiny certificate that you've got from a verification agency. It's a change in who has skills and who is capital and who builds companies and who gets hired and all of that. But that really does start at the most foundational level in a South African or any society, and that is with human capital development. Ricardo Hausman, very strong on that. Whenever he comes to advise the South African government again, you wonder what happens to all of that good advice. Well, that was the Monocle Banking Podcast, as always, curated by Monocle Solutions. I was joined by Donald Mackay of XA Global Trade Advisors and Dr. Daan Steenkamp of Codera, who have been extremely courageous in producing a very insightful survey and some data, some evidence to back up the debate around what BEE is actually producing. I'm Michael Avery. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and tune in next week for more insights on the Monocle Banking Podcast.